I'm Linda Mollenhauer, and I'm chair of Ignite NPS, which is a foundation. And I'm co-lead with Erin on the Reimagining Governance initiative. Been in the sector a long time, and spent lots of time as a consultant. And way back, I was the CEO of Imagine Canada, and created lots of different resources and tools for the sector over the years. So really looking forward to spending the next while with all of you, even if you'll hear from us more than we'll hear from you.
Thanks, Linda. Hi, everybody. My name is Erin. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the project co-lead on behalf of the Ontario Nonprofit Network for Reimagining Governance. Background in community engagement, sort of
Aiden, Aiden, I'm sorry, we have some issue with your mic.
Hello?
Yes, good now.
My apologies, everybody. I seem to have mic challenges, even though I use Zoom every day. So I'll just start again. My name is Erin Kang. My pronouns are she and her. I am the project co-lead for Reimagining Governance on behalf of the Ontario Nonprofit Network. And I actually come to this work with a background in community engagement, in sort of arts-based equity work, grassroots. And my interest in reimagining governance is in reimagining so many of the systems that we currently live in and pursuing different ways of doing things, challenging the status quo. And so it's really exciting to be here today to talk about the future of governance with all of you. So thank you so much for being here. We'd like to start by just asking you to take a long inhale through your nose, just. And then exhale and lower your shoulders away from your ears. And just for a moment, I want you to transport yourself into the future. And so for you, that might be 5 years from now, or 1 year from now, or maybe next month. But we'd like to invite you to imagine that your organization has decided that it's going to establish a governance aspiration, right? Something to aspire towards actualizing. And let's say this aspiration was the following. We will hold shared power and responsibility in the spirit of collaboration, mutual trust, and listening, where leadership and power is distributed to where and who in the system is in the best position to exercise it, right? Where, who, and where in the system is in the best position to exercise it. Now, if this was your governance aspiration, what kinds of things would be made possible? What would it cause you to think about or to do differently? And I invite you to feel free to share any of your thoughts with us in the chat. Now, this aspiration that we've shared with you is drawn from the work of a real organization that created something called a culture manifesto for itself, right? For their own organization. They didn't quite call it a governance aspiration. I believe they called it a guiding principle or a value. And we adapted it here to formulate it into a governance aspiration. But we really invite you to think about what could be made possible.
And we put this up too because I think it really touches on a lot of what we're trying to do with reimagining governance. It first of all creates an aspiration, something to reach towards, and it also raises all kinds of reimagining kind of questions and opportunities that we'll be working our way through with reimagining governance, like who is in charge of governance, who should have a voice in governance decision making. It makes you, that aspiration makes you think about what about our governance culture might help or hinder our ability to reach this aspiration, and is it possible for the board to be less the home of governance and more the host of governance. So in a sense, we start here. And as we make our way through this presentation today, we're going to touch down on what reimagining governance is trying to do around some of these areas. We're and we'll touch on why we think it's important to reimagine governance. We'll give you a sense of where we're at in terms of the initiative itself. We want to talk about what makes this a unique approach, because that will, we hope, start to stimulate in your own minds some different ways of looking at your own governance. And we'll be walking through a map of the governance system. As part of our conversation about why reimagine, we're going to touch on 5 impacts that are shaping and significantly influencing governance design. And so that's what we'll be touching down on over the course of this session.
Thank you, Linda. And we really invite you to keep these questions on your mind as we go through our presentation today, and to share what it raises for you. And we see here it could lead to a more equal approach, a less hierarchical approach, which is absolutely one amazing thing that could happen from that. And so I'd love to share with you what is reimagining governance. I do see some familiar faces in the room, so hello, hello. But I also see some new folks, and you might not have heard of us before. So Reimagining Governance is an initiative of ONN and Ignite NPS. Our goal is to generate new and innovative ways to fulfill governance. And we want to do that by provoking a shift in how we talk about it, not just as leaders within nonprofit organizations, but alongside other key influencers throughout the sector and beyond, like funders, system partners, and capacity builders. We want to show that there's an incredible urgency and potential for designing better governance. And so far, we've built an incredible group of champions who have been co-creating with us and are helping to seed and spread this work.
Some of whom I see are on this session with us today. So the initiative started about 2.5 years ago, and it started by really focusing on research and consultations. And the reason we started there was we thought it was really important to think about what's the problem we're solving for, and because if you can't name what you're solving for, then it's hard to determine where you go from there. And so we really spent time thinking about why is it we need to reimagine? What could we be doing better?
Okay, so we want to hear from you. I'm going to launch just a quick poll. And we want to know, do you believe that over the next 5 years, the way that we do governance does need to be vastly different? Do you think it actually only needs to change somewhat? Or do you actually think things are pretty good, mostly the same? So as we get that going, what we're going to be spending the rest of, or not the rest of, but some of the next time is, oh, wow. Okay, so we have a pretty even, an even showing between being vastly different and changing somewhat. That's really interesting. And we're going to talk a little bit about why we think that we actually need to reimagine governance.
It's actually very exciting to us to see that nobody put C. So that's very encouraging. And I think that's really interesting, because my guess is, had we asked this same question maybe 3 years ago, we probably would have had, but we have 3% now. And I shouldn't discourage anybody who wants to put C, but I think there'd be far more people who would be saying that we need to stay mostly the same. So I think we're seeing this big shift in terms of what we need to, our governance and how well it's working. So in terms of then, what have we learned about why reimagining is necessary? What is it that we could do better? And I would start with, just based on my own experience working 40 years in the sector, And a lot of the same issues that I've seen us be dealing with over that period of time are so many of the same challenges of recruitment, of competency, of finding the right competencies, of groups keeping their fingers in the right pots. We've been talking a long time about creating more diverse boards. And one of our ahas, and certainly our consultations led us to the conclusion that maybe what we've been doing is we've been sort of tinkering around the edges, tweaking, sort of focusing our time on tweaking symptoms and not really diving in and looking at some of the root issues that are keeping us from some of these solutions. So we felt that what we really need to focus on is to really think about, let's maybe challenge some of the assumptions that we have about how governance is designed and really focus on finding those new and innovative ways to come at it. We also have watched over the years that the expectations of boards has just grown like this. It's been extraordinary. And yet when you think of it, the time and availability of board members to be able to keep up with all of those expectations and be able to get access to training and educational materials, and there's lots of good ones around, but it's there's sort of a gap between those expectations and the construct that we've put in place of a board being the key governance body within an organization. So our sense is we're going to continue to struggle with some of the issues that we talked about around recruitment and finding the right competencies and people being able to understand how governance works and so on, if we keep ourselves confined to this same construct of centering so much of the governance work just in the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're even seeing here in the chat, right? Like, absolutely, volunteer boards experience so much of these struggles. And it is hard to know how much to change without a concrete idea of the benefits, especially because often governance models and reviews don't take into account as much as it could the broader systemic sort of factors. And so this is tied to your point, Linda, but governance isn't actually the clearest it could be. People are all over the spectrum in terms of understanding governance. It's a large topic, and it's also full of very vague and often loaded words. And so if we take, for example, the word oversight, it is open to actually a lot of different kinds of interpretations, such as direct and control or supervise, all the way over to just a failure to notice something. And so how people and organizations, teams, interpret that single word has huge implications for governance power dynamics, how things are done, how things are interpreted. We've also completed some research looking at the trends and forces that are impacting and shaping nonprofit organizations. And a lot of the actual trends will sound familiar to you. They're, especially if you've done foresight work or things like SWOT analyses, you'll hear things like, real engagement and participation are core expectations that people have, or the digitalization of work. But what we've done is really zero in on how those trends and forces impact governance specifically. And we're actually going to share those 5 impacts with you today. And the impacts that these macro trends and forces are actually having on the design of governance. And when we say design, what do we mean, right? We mean how things are arranged, how things function, who's involved, how are things done. And so our research found 5 key impacts. Let me put them up now as I speak to you. So yes, our research found 5 key impacts that the macro trends and forces are having specifically on governance design. And maybe you can think of more, please share them. Importantly, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of these things have accelerated, right? The impacts are deeper, they're quicker, they're being felt more acutely. So we also can't assume that we can just keep doing things in the same way. The future of governance is the present. We're in it right now. And this is an opportunity on many fronts, including governance, to really refresh the way that we do things.
Great. We may want to get, I think the poll is still up on my screen. We may just want to get rid of the poll. For many of you who are in the sector, worked in the sector a long time, as Erin said, a lot of these are going to sound quite familiar to you. And so really at the end of the day, as you just mentioned, Erin, what's changed is all of these have just accelerated significantly in terms of how important they are and how important they are for organizations to respond to them. So based on sort of some of the 10 critical trends that we've seen out there, these are the 5, starting with the combination of leadership skills, experience, and knowledge required to navigate this very dynamic nonprofit landscape has become very complex. Passion continues to be an essential part of any sort of competency of any governance leaders, but governance leaders also they have to be adaptive, they have to be entrepreneurial, they need to be technologically savvy and able to span boundaries, and at the same time they need to be very proficient risk managers. They need to be able to use data strategically and be comfortable with very complicated financing models. So moving forward, it won't be enough for organizations to say that we're just limited in terms of who we can recruit and the competencies that we can get hold of. In governance design, the structures and the approaches are going to need to shift to be able to address that, so that they can draw from a broader network of people and draw in that right mix of skills, experience, and knowledge to be able to govern. So again, these competencies aren't going to surprise anybody, but it's in the combination of them and the those expectations that we talked about. So instead of organizations saying, yes, but we just don't have access to all of that, we're saying with governance, we need to rethink how can we reconfigure things to be able to respond effectively to that.
So the second one here, equity, diversity, and inclusion as governance imperatives. Not only has there been an upswell of attention shed upon longstanding systemic and structural racism, underpinned by anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, and the intersections that exist in addition to race, but also the realities of inequity that were further exposed, deepened by the pandemic. So organizations are being called upon with a newly invigorated rigor to pursuing action around systemic oppression. And this means that equity, diversity, and inclusion are non-negotiable. It's not enough for organizations to simply have a diversity of people and perspectives involved in governance, right? Equity, diversity, and inclusion, it must be woven in to the fabric of the governance design, its culture, the processes, the practices, planning, recruitment. And so if we think about this impact on governance, what does that mean when it comes to governance design? Let's imagine, right? So barriers that are removed from structures and processes so that a diversity of individuals can not only access the board and the board table, but authentically participate in governance decision-making more broadly, which might include having deep and intentional conversations about values and social norms and dominant ideologies and perspectives. And we see this happening, right? As well, it could also mean that, so here's the thing, when boards and governance bodies better understand and better enfold equity, diversity, and inclusion into their governance, by de facto, they will appreciate that tokenistic representation, actually counteracts those efforts. And so this will also, we see, result in more expansive ways to ensure that we're designing for that diversity of voices to actually actively contribute to governance decision-making. So that's an example of how it would look for governance design.
And I guess the next one is the in response to the volume and pace of change, the shifting expectations, and just the complexity of the nonprofit ecosystem, governance design is increasingly promoting and enabling adaptability and agility. And it's been interesting when you think about the pandemic. Organizations have really excelled. And again, 2 years ago, we would have talked about being adaptive and agile, and certainly there are lots of language around that and lots of conversations about that. But what we've been able to prove is the capacity for organizations to be able to do that. So in terms of governance, then what does that look like? So decision making is nimble. The governance culture values both change and resiliency, and leaders can pivot easily as circumstances change, seize opportunities, and kind of welcome complexity rather than resist that. And that is what we have seen from so many organizations during this pandemic. So in a sense, this one is a more, as things begin to settle into whatever they're going to settle into, holding on to that notion. So, and carrying that forward. And because with this focus on adaptiveness and agility, it's going to be able to allow governance leaders to address and anticipate some of the challenges in the landscape. It'll provide the flexibility to meet the expectations of multiple generations that are actively engaged in organizations. And really importantly, it will allow stakeholders to be more responsive to the complex collaborations and partnerships that are taking place between organizations, between programs, within communities, and at the system level. So that's where adaptiveness and agility is so critical. So what are some examples of the implications for your own governance? What might be some of the things that you should be thinking about, and will be some of the best practices? Will be governance structures are going to be more fluid. They won't be as cemented into rigid charts that we have seen over the years in more traditional models. So that means there will be far more time-limited task groups and fewer standing committees. Governance processes, including the planning cycles, which will be much more continuous and iterative, and the importance of early warning systems of threats and opportunities will both become a shift in how the kinds of things that governance leaders need to pay attention to. One of the conversations that becomes so important with this is, and as important to create rationales, is what in your governance decision making needs to be more formal and stable, dealing with making sure you're complying with regulations and making high-risk decisions is going to have to be more formal and stable. But there is lots that can be more adaptive and agile, like stakeholder engagement and strategic decision making. So the key there is to try to intentionally ask yourselves what needs to be formal and stable, what can be more adaptive and agile in terms of structures, processes. The third is the governance culture will value foresight, the ability to look forward. I think that's been driven home, how important that is. And generative thinking will rise in terms of the ability, the cultures that promote those two things, foresight and generative thinking, will become really critical while keeping the mission at the center of every decision, because agility doesn't work if there isn't a clear sense of what the purpose is, and that becomes the absolute North Star to anything that is done and allows organizations to be more agile. And the last is there'll be more continuous conversations that look at some of these long held assumptions, norms, and habits that have gotten in the way of rapid governance decision-making and problem solving. And then an intentional approach to say, how can we explicitly reset those? So it'll become much more intentional approach to all of this, because every organization has all kinds of those habits and norms that if you looked at, you'd say those are, there may be some that enhance an ability to be agile and adaptive, and others will hinder it.
Thanks, Linda. And thank you all for the great questions that are coming through in the chat as well. And we will get to those sort of at the end of our presentation. So the fourth big impact on governance design that we're seeing is that governance decision-making is more broadly shared. And you'll sort of see all of these impacts are very much interwoven, right? Traditional approaches to governance design, they're very much built around these static and siloed hierarchical approaches. But this is changing away from this idea of a hierarchy of bosses at the top towards more participatory designs that engage more voices in governance decision-making, like I said before. And this is partially spurred by technology, but also by an actual desire for more active participation in decision-making. And this is tied to embedding equity throughout governance. So what are the examples of some of those implications on governance design? Well, perhaps as Linda mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, boards can begin to see themselves more as the host of governance and the home of governance. Perhaps boards become more adept coaches handling a wider span of decision makers by using the digital tools, by delegating specific decisions and authorities to groups of stakeholders. Also, governance functions could be fulfilled by those who are in the best position to fulfill them, not just because a structure happens to be in place. And I think this is a consistent thing that we find ourselves saying, is that form must follow function. We cannot, say, well, here's one structure, so let's get it to do all of these different things. So I'll pass it back to you, Linda, to go over the last one.
The last one, technology is rewiring the way governance work is done, and everybody's seen that in their workplaces. Again, over the last year, everything's been accelerated. That might have been some kind of a trend, has just progressed at rapid paces. So I think what becomes interesting about this for governance is that it means that geography will matter less, opens up all kinds of opportunities for, as Erin said, a more distributed, participatory, and even agile ability to reach out in a very different way, because geography will matter less. Governance leaders can collaborate more effectively, and strategic decision making will be based more often on data, not just hard data, qualitative and quantitative data, but perhaps less on hunches. And the this increase in virtual work is, I think you have all seen this, has prompted a real, almost systematic reconsideration of what the office means, but it's also reconfiguring the concept of the boardroom table, and so that provides all kinds of wonderful opportunities to do things differently. And again, I would say in terms of some of the practices that we're going to see, governance leaders, one will be governance leaders looking at those norms and habits and processes that need to be reset, starting to ask the question more intentionally, which of course many organizations have been doing over the last year, is what will need to be an in-person governance? What will require in-person? What can be done virtually? Like so many routine decisions can be done virtually. And how does this free up, or how will it free up our capacity for more of those generative and strategic governance conversations? You often hear people talking about everything can go virtual now. Isn't that wonderful? We can all just live on Zoom. But with organizing, and there'll be a temptation amongst many organizations to do more things virtually because it'll save some money. But having that very intentional conversation about what needs to be in person and what doesn't need to be in person. The governance culture will focus more on we'll have to focus more on building connections and trust between governance leaders so that they can have those tough or complex conversations when necessary virtually. So that will be another key thing. And of course, strategic decision making, which we've always talked about strategic decision making needing to be evidence-based and data-based. But I think now those organizations who can effectively do that will really distinguish themselves from those that can't, because again, it's going to be something that is expected of organizations that probably wouldn't have been true to the same degree a number of years ago. So we'll stop there and maybe come at some of your questions before we move to the next section.
Yeah, sure, we can do the questions. So one of the questions was, are we thinking about medium or large organizations, and saying that it translates perhaps less easily to grassroots or community organizations? And I think just to start, I think one of our approaches, which we'll actually talk about in this next section where we talk about the different pathways that reimagining governance is working on to address some of these things, is that we actually think that this applies to, or this could apply to all nonprofits. And what we're actually saying is that there's not one right way of doing things, and that it's about finding those nuances and the strategies and innovations that work based on the unique circumstances of each organization. I wonder, Linda, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think it has to, and we're going to come to that question. Maybe be able to answer that question when you hear what we're going to be producing. It may respond effectively to that one.
So why don't we head over to that? And I'm just going to share this next poll with folks, and you can close it by yourself. I've been notified, just to see which of these impacts on governance felt maybe the most impactful or resonant with you, whether it was about the more complex skills, experience, and knowledge, equity, diversity, and inclusion as imperatives, adaptiveness and agility, more broadly shared decision-making, or how technology rewires the way governance work is done. And as folks are thinking about that, we think all 5 of these impacts on governance are critical. And when we think about the future of governance, our approaches and our solutions need to be expansive in order to address the realities that we exist in. And although these broader trends and forces will impact organizations differently, they're all urgent and they're all game changing for the design of governance. And so we can't just keep the same design of governance. And just to add a bit of nuance to that is also, we're not saying that all organizations need to drastically change what is being done, but rather it's about is that intentionality piece and that attention piece of, is this the right thing for us to do? Is this the right way that we should be working? Are there new and different ways that we can be working in order to reach our goals? So thank you for participating in the poll. I'm just going to say that 34% of people chose equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then right behind that are the skills, experience, and knowledge. And these things, as we mentioned, are intimately connected, right? And as somebody mentioned in the chat, lived experience as a core piece in the skills matrix that we need to be looking for. So absolutely, thank you very much. I'm just going to end that here.
Were there any other questions that surfaced on this section before we move on?
Let's see, some great chats here, but Linda, why don't we get to the questions at the end of the presentation?
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Well, so let's, we're going to switch over and talk a little bit about what it is that Reimagining Governance is doing to be able to help organizations respond to some of the things that we've been talking about. And I guess the way we've started is by developing a number of different pathways that organizations can take to look at their own governance, and that will generate sort of ideas and innovations of how it could be done even better than it is now. We're creating a whole series of resources and tools to help organizations do that. And as we're actually still in the process of developing those, and we have just launched a series of learning labs. And the opportunity in the learning labs is to look at the process we've developed, which we'll talk some more about, and also some of the research we've developed and some of the other resources, and bring them into actual organizations and see how they work. We intentionally didn't come at this by getting far along in terms of what those tools and processes would look like, and then piloting them. We decided it would be a far better approach to create learning labs with each of the organizations. So the understanding is we'll bring them through these processes and utilize these tools, and they in turn will, and they will get lots outcomes out of that, but also they'll be co-creators with us and saying, okay, that worked very well, or that did not work at all well. And so we hope to come out of the learning labs, which will be completed by September, and be able to actually finalize all of the processes and tools and get them ready to make them available to everybody. I mean, that question about to what degree is this going to be useful to grassroots versus very traditional, larger organized or mature organizations? We're really aiming to make it appropriate for both the full spectrum of organizations. And in our learning labs, we've intentionally selected organizations that will allow us to look at it from that perspective. So over to you on what makes this unique.
Well, actually, I think before I do that, I'm just going to quickly share a little peek at what the transformative design process that is being tested in the learning labs looks like. So this is just a very simple journey map that shows the broad buckets that organizations working with us are going through. And, you know, the understanding the influencers is very much for example, taking the trends and forces impacts of governance work that we did and having intentional dialogue and conversation about their organization's relationship to those 5 impacts, right? And really taking some time to name and understand explicitly and intentionally what those influences are. Same with exploring culture and thinking about the organization's unique circumstances. And from this place of sort of deep seeing, right? Like seeing and surfacing what the governance landscape is currently, then moving towards thinking about creating governance aspirations, as we shared before, and then creating actions and strategies to meet those aspirations based on the number of tools and activities we've created. So I just wanted to share that little view with you, and yeah, and to talk about some ways that we think our approach is unique, which on the one hand, it's really exciting to be working on something that feels really new and not done before, but also means that there's not that many examples out there for us to be leaning on. So one approach or one way that our approach is unique is that we're not making another model, right? And we're co-creating a process. And we say co-create because, you know, we realized early on we couldn't have one steering group or committee that was, you know, working alongside us for this whole time. We've actually, in developing the transformative design process, in developing the framework that we're going to be sharing with you, dozens and dozens and dozens of people have contributed their expertise, their experience, their knowledge to the things that we're working on. So we're co-creating a process rather than a model that enables organizations to really think about their governance in a customized way, to find their own innovations, their own actions and strategies based on their unique circumstances. And in the past, there has been a lot of focus on prescribed models and best practices. I'm going to share with you here. Oops.
Whoops.
There we go. So yes.
You put up our outline.
Yep, I will. Technology. Okay. So yes, there has been a lot of focus on prescribed models and best practices. But what happens is that they force organizations to squish into a box that just might not be the right fit for them. And this goes back to the question about who is this for? It's not for a specific type of organization, because what we are encouraging is that organizations take the time to figure out the approaches and best practices that work for them, right? And as much as we want to believe it, nonprofits are not cats, and we're going to take that messaging far into the future.
Right. The second way the approach is perhaps different than what is often done is that we're taking an aspiration based approach to strengthening governance rather than what you I think more often see, which is a problem solution approach. And so we believe, and we'll be testing this in the learning labs, is that if we can focus people based on what they've learned about their own circumstances, if we can focus them on aspirations, it'll get at some of the root issues and opportunities and keep it away from being mired in symptoms. So, for example, we want conversations to not be sort of limited to how do we make our 12-member board more diverse, and we pop that up to an inspiration to say, how can we create more diversity in our governance decision making? So that's sort of a shift in how we're approaching it.
Yeah. The third way that we think that we're unique in our approach is that we're looking at governance through this wider lens of a complex system. And this is different from the norm. When you look at most of the literature and resources out there, there's a great focus on creating more effective boards or efficient boards, which is important. We don't want to diminish that, but it's just not the whole picture, right? It's looking at governance in too simple of a way. And if you've ever wondered why governance is so hard, it's because there are all of these moving and interconnected, interrelated components. So we've tried to pull those components apart into a map of an organization's governance system. And then the job of strengthening governance is actually to reflect on and address all these components as opposed to just narrowing down on a few. And so we're going to share this map with you, and it's a bit of a sneak peek. It's not released publicly yet. And so, but it will be available really soon. Linda, you wanted to jump in? Or
No.
Oh, so there is an earlier version of this map. It's available for download right now on our webpage. And this newer version we will share includes more fleshed out descriptions of each component. And we're going to quickly walk through it because the transformative design process that we mentioned follows this map. And it touches through the activities and processes and dialogue. It touches on all these various components that are critical to governance design. And it's sort of like an articulation of what we mean when we say governance is a complex system.
So if we, you'll see that it's circular and continuous, but we would like to point you at what is both the starting point and the end point of governance, and the ultimate, and that's the ultimate goal of governance, which is to enable meaningful impacts for communities. And I think it's interesting because, again, just illustrating the point, if so many ways that we typically talk about governance, it goes, if you go over to that swirl, it goes immediately with structure. And it starts with structure because it starts talking about the board. And then it talks about what do the board processes look like? Who should we be recruiting to the board? What kind of committees need to be put in place? So we're shifting it over to say everything should start and end with is governance ultimately enabling impacts for whichever communities it is you serve. And so we think the interesting thing about starting there, and if you were to take this into your organization and have some conversations, and that was a starting place, you could ask yourself, who is your organization accountable for those impacts? And by thinking about that as a starting place, it'll get you to also be thinking about, then what does that tell us about who should be engaged in our governance decision making? So again, you don't start way over in the swirl under structures, you start with the ultimate goal. And then if we move to the if we move up to the role of governance, and this will sound very familiar to you. Maybe the difference is that we don't use the board. We don't use the idea of governance and the board interchangeably. So if the role of governance is to provide stewardship, sense making, and foresight, and governance leaders take responsibility for ensuring stakeholders have confidence in the organization's integrity, its legitimacy, its viability. when you start to define governance that way, as opposed to the role of governance is for the board to do the following things, then you start to say, whoa, in terms of providing stewardship, sense making, and foresight, there are, first of all, automatically more people who are involved in governance than the board. I would, the CEO or executive director does as much work on stewardship and sense making and foresight as often as the board does. So that starts to pop out the potential in terms of who's involved in governance. But it also reminds us how important it is to have a shared understanding of what we mean by governance, because whatever that understanding is going to drive your choice of processes and structures. So, so it's interesting to think about, if you take this sort of more open description of what the role of governance is, and you brought it into your organization and asked people around the table to say, with broader stakeholders than just the board, what do we mean? What do we mean by the word stewardship and viability? Would you get the same answer right around the table by everybody? And if there are widely divergent views, what impact is that having on how you're making governance decision making, how you're making governance decisions, and even the choice of who has a voice and what structures you put in place to do that. So that's why it's so important to start on that side.
Yeah. So the map then takes us to fixed requirements and governance functions. I'll get to functions in a moment, but the fixed requirements are the binding rules that drive your governance design, right? So these are going to be different depending on where and how you're incorporated and what sector you're in, and includes the responsibilities that must be fulfilled by the board and can't be done by any other person or entity. And one of the tools that we are able to share quite soon is an educational resource that actually describes the legal and regulatory requirements that boards need to follow. And these are things that only the board can do. But they're actually quite a short list when we strip it down to their essentials. And it doesn't mean that that's all they should do, right? But once you know what those baselines are, you can start to think, okay, how do we share roles and responsibilities and functions? And so if we shift over to the functions, and actually I'll zero in on, this will be available in the public release document, but I'll zero in on this. And these functions will feel familiar to you as well, but they're different because they are not presented as a description of the roles and responsibilities of the board. They are functions that can and should be shared more broadly. And they're also different because you'll notice that we didn't include operational functions like fundraising, advocacy activities, program development. Now, these are critical functions, and many boards do and can and should perform those roles, but we just distinguished that they aren't governance functions. And we display the functions here on a continuum of being highly strategic, like setting the organization's purpose or developing strategic direction, right, to highly routine, such as safeguarding assets and ensuring the organization is complying with all the laws and regulations relevant to that organization. And the significance of distinguishing these as governance functions rather than board roles and responsibilities is that it actually starts to release some of that power and expectation from the board. So things like setting the organization's purpose and doing strategic planning work suddenly aren't only a responsibility of the board, but a function of governance that needs to be done and can be done by a variety of people that can include the board. And so it begins to prompt questions around, what functions must be done by the board and what can be shared or delegated or done by other people. And this question will be different for a small working board, right, of a smaller organization or a grassroots organization to a more complex board. So it's really about finding that nuance and figuring out, asking yourself, who is in the best position to fulfill these functions?
Okay, back to the map, to the influencers, and Erin touched on these before. And I think lots of organizations have looked at the trends and forces through, or opportunities and threats through environmental scanning or foresight work that are shaping their actual organization. But few really zero in and say, what are the impacts specifically on our governance and our governance design? So we, one of the parts of the process is, as Erin mentioned, is to explore those and think about those. The other is around the circumstances. And again, this is one of those things that a lot of organizations know and understand, but rarely have intentional conversations about it. Certainly do it at one time, where they say, where are we in the life cycle? Because that can have a big impact on the degree of formality you require in your organizations. What's our financing model? Because that has huge implication in terms of what kind of risk tolerance you have and the complexity of your accountabilities, even looking at your history and some of your habits and how that has shaped the way governance is working. So so what we do in this process that we think is helpful is sort of pull those out and declare them and map them, because in doing that, that then feeds into what is next in our map, which is the design playground.
Yes, and we're almost done, so we'll be able to address the questions, the great questions that are in the chat. So the design playground, and this is where, as we say, the rubber really hits the road. And I don't drive, so I don't know if that makes sense. Well, I guess I cycle, so it still makes sense. And this is where it becomes really evident with these 4 enablers here. We've got culture, people, structures, and processes. And we've been sort of referring to the design of governance, and this is really what we mean. These 4 enablers are very much interconnected. If you change one, it impacts another. So for example, you could put an amazing process in place and then have it derailed because of a handful of people, or something happened, or maybe the culture wasn't conducive, or perhaps a mindset shift amongst governance leaders can actually lead to innovation. Those are, it's very much interconnected, and often we might focus on one of the enablers. And when it comes to governance, we've often focused a lot on structures and processes. But we have to recognize that because they're so deeply interconnected, in order to actually shift and change how we do governance, we actually need to consider how these 4 things reinforce each other. And culture is a really interesting one because it functions as both an enabler as well as something that actually influences governance. And so one aspect of the transformative design process, as we mentioned before, is exploring culture in relation to governance specifically, and through a variety of reflective questions and activities to capture a snapshot of the stated or intended culture, as well as the experienced culture in the organization, and to have a reflective conversation about some of the things that might not be visible or have not been surfaced yet. And the intent of this is tied back to one of the impacts on governance we spoke about earlier, being able to have open and honest conversations about the forces in us, in our team, that can really impact governance. And we believe that even being able to name those things could actually spark different ways of thinking and about and doing governance work. And so, if you asked yourself what aspirations inspire your governance design, then, for example, the aspiration that we shared earlier today could be something that drives those decision makings.
Great. And the last piece, and then we have one more poll for you, but the last piece is documenting your governance. And it's interesting, there was organizations that we've talked to who said, well, I don't know how much innovation we can bring about because these bylaws, and they pretty well tell us how to do things. So we have we've put documents sort of in on the map at the root, that it isn't a driver in itself, because of course it can be changed. Some aspects are harder to change than others, but it's a process, whether it's your bylaws or your governance manual. It's a process for documenting what your governance needs to look like. So that's the end of our map, and we have a poll for you, our last.
Yeah, promise. So this poll, we wanted to ask, what is your reaction to governance as a complex system? Is it a totally new perspective and you like it or you agree? Is it totally new and you don't really like it or you don't really agree? Is it not new to you and you like it or agree? Is it not new to you and you don't like it or you don't agree? And maybe you're not sure. It's a lot of new information. Well, I'll just leave that open for a moment. And I think I want to close our speaking portion by thanking you for taking the time in your day to be with us. And we're really looking forward to continuing to share what we learn from the Learning Labs, and to be able to hopefully generate and share some stories and share our tools that have been improved by this Learning Lab process that can really help to continue this work and this conversation. It's really exciting because we really do believe that this is a new approach to addressing governance and the future of governance. But it's also an experience because, as mentioned, there are very few examples out there. There are no templates. And so we thank you for being on this journey while we learn and experiment. The map and the governance framework I mentioned, we will be releasing shortly. I'm having a little bit of issue with our newsletter form. So I'm going to put up my contact information. You can just email me, erin@theonn.ca, and I can add you to our listserv to receive those updates. And see if Linda has any closing words to say.
No, I'm keen to hear about the questions.
Yeah, and so just to share the poll results, it's great to see that this isn't new to you and you like it and you agree. And some folks, it is new and like it. And some folks also aren't quite sure or don't really like it or don't really disagree. And that's totally fair. So thank you so much for sharing those. And I'm just going to scroll through the chat and address some of the great questions that we have here. Okay. And please feel free to continue to add some. So I'm just going to make sure that I don't miss any by going up to the top here. Okay, a lack of capacity has always been a problem in the nonprofit sector. How do we overcome a lack of capacity to set up any governance systems, let alone the right ones?
I guess first of all, there is no right governance system. Every organization is going to be going to approach it differently, and that's why we think coming at it as your own journey and customizing it is more important than just adopting a model. In terms of the capacity issue, I think that is a significant issue, and it's part of the reason we're suggesting that we need to open up this notion of who's involved in governance and how governance is done, because by broadening that out, that understanding, then I think that it helps to deal with some of the capacity of getting enough people or the right competencies involved in governance. Your governance design should be a design that works for you. So that's where perhaps following the map and following it in terms of building out from there and designing according to that will be a good approach for you.
Thanks, Linda. And I agree with your thoughts. So I don't really have much to add there. And just a great comment here. The application of a new form of governance is something that we apply to our board, as well as consult with other organizations on the development of their board. For us, looking at the board and work in a different way was intentional and focused. And I agree, some things we did keep formal. So yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the questions that we end up getting are well, so does that mean we should do this? Or, you know, does that mean that the best thing for us is to do this? And I think our answer consistently is, actually, our approach and our process is about having these intentional questions and conversations with yourself, within your teams, and finding those approaches that work from a place of viewing governance in this multifaceted and complex, interrelated way. And also understanding, oh, okay, the board is one structure out of a many number of possible structures that could be put in place in order to fulfill these functions. It's one player. And so, yeah. Anything to add there, Linda?
I would just add that our real ultimate goal, as in the fall when we start to have these available to everybody, is we're not, our goal isn't based on having 75% of organizations utilizing this. But what we want to do is start to really generate some stories of different ways of coming at governance that perhaps break out of some of the ones we've seen and heard about. Whether you're a grassroots organization or a big complex organization, we think it'll be those stories that are so important. So we're going to be capturing them and sharing them broadly.
And if I may, I mean, I'm a part of sort of that cohort of next generation leaders, right? That are in the sector, that are younger, that have different expectations and realities that we're working within. And so it's also about ensuring that we're not just paying lip service to saying, oh, well, we need more diverse boards, we need to engage more young people, but really actually thinking about how that looks like on a larger scale. And there's a couple questions here that I think we can answer sort of together. One being, have the organizations for the learning labs already been selected? And the others being, will you share the experiences from the organizations rolling this out? And how is the ONN board responding? And those are such great questions. So we did already select the learning lab organizations. We sort of needed to, within our timeline, find organizations that were open to our approach and also had the time and also had the capacity and resources in order to do this within our timeline. And so, but we will be sharing who those organizations are soon. We're working on a little blog post about it. And we're going to be sharing the experiences and the stories along the way. So again, I encourage you to get in touch with me to join our newsletter, because that is where we'll be sharing that stuff. And the board, so initially, actually, we've been a very iterative initiative. The pandemic hit, many things had to shift. And initially, we did hope that the ONN board would go through the whole process, but we also didn't want to take the spot of another organization doing it. So ONN is actually, our board is going to be, they've been a huge part of the sort of development process. They're so supportive, and they'll be testing some of our smaller tools and really working with us along the way to co-create, and is yeah, absolutely totally on board and supportive.
And just to add to that, that we put out as broad a sweep to organizations. So we didn't sort of select organizations ourselves. We put out an open invitation, and it's based on those that responded.
Thank you. Just going through here. So the Reimagining Governance Initiative, will it give us a process for boards to undergo their own change management? And thank you for asking this question, because, and Linda, I'd love to know if you have a different answer from me, but mine is, not quite. So we are hoping to give a process that allows organizations to have these reflective questions, to think about these themes in the ways that relate to their own organization, and to hopefully be able to strategize and create actions from that work. And so it's not specifically providing a change management process, but rather a process to help reflect upon and unlock different ways of thinking about governance.
But inevitably, what we hope we're going to see, we hope that it prompts sort of some innovations. They might be small 5% shifts that really leverage all kinds of other things. Some organizations may take it on as a much bigger change process, but change because we're seeking innovations and new things, change will be a part of it. So we'll be building in some of the principles of good change management processes as we go through it.
Thanks, Linda. David Feldman asked for Ontario or for all of Canada. And I'm just wondering, David, if you're still here, to type into the chat what you were referring to so we can answer. And then the next question here being,
maybe if it's meant, will we be working with, we're working specifically with Ontario-based organizations, but we believe that this will be able to be adopted across the country. And interestingly, other capacity building organizations like ONN across the country have just all decided to look at a reimagining governance sort of process in the different provinces.
thanks, Linda. It also could have been in reference to the requirements of the board document, and so that was based in Ontario parameters. Yeah.
Yes.
And so a bit of another sort of dual question. Do we have a sense of when the report back from the learning labs will be? And also, it would be great to know what the organizations that are involved are in order to better understand the depth and the breadth of the testing process. And yes, absolutely, we want to, as we said, sort of profile the folks and share the story along the way. And so you can follow ONN on Twitter. It's at O_N_. I can put that in the chat in a moment. I just can't do multiple things at once. And yeah, and then again, if you email me, and again, I'll share my email. And I think actually Tarana has already done so. So thank you. Okay, and then finally.
But it will be the fall before we have the outcomes from the learning labs.
Yeah, optimistically the fall. You know, as we've been going, we do think that we need to wrap up the labs by September, and then it'll be a matter of kind of processing and digesting all of the learnings from working with the lab organizations. This is a really important question. Is anyone else starting to ask about governance that is less Eurocentric? My board is excited to explore that question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. So I know that, for example, Taibu Community Health Center has done some great work around Black governance and leadership, and addressing the barriers that Black populations have in accessing leadership tables, and really thinking about the structural reasons for that, and leaning on rather Afrocentric modes of governance. And so if you go to or if you just Google Taibu, here, I'll type it in here, Taibu CHC, you'll find information about that project. And then, of course, there's a many number of Indigenous-led organizations such as the Circle and OFIFC. I'm not sure if they have specific resources, but Indigenous modes of knowing and of governance are really critical to look to. And so those are some examples that you can, yeah, no problem. I'm just going to do a quick scan to make sure that there's not any other questions. So in the meantime, Linda, did you have anything else you wanted to share?
No, I think these venues are always challenging. We would just love to be interacting with you, but hope that this has been helpful to you. And I know that there's a lot we're saying is coming down the pike. And I think we'll have so much to share come the fall that I think you'll find very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I've just put our contact information up here for you, and we'll make sure that I catch the emails that folks chatted to me over here. And I guess we will just thank you and close this conversation, and really thank you so much to the whole team at OCASI for hosting us and for having us. And if anyone from OCASI wanted to say some closing words and share the survey, that would be great.